So our goals for today are trying to make you all wildlife trained arborists, trying to get you experience in all of the things that we think a wildlife trained arborist needs to do. And so we're going to go through as many of these as we can, especially pre-work inspections. So how this fits into the picture is hopefully everybody was there last week on Wednesday and got to hear sort of the general picture. Right now, we're going to focus on California and pre-work inspections. Next Wednesday, we're going to focus on California and setting buffers and working around these areas after we've completed our pre-work inspection. But there's lots of other topics around. Feel free to tune in on any topic that sounds good to you. You're welcome to come to all 7 sessions of the workshop. So let's talk a little bit about state laws and categories. So last week we talked about the federal laws, and the main ones being the Eagle Act, the Endangered Species Act, and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act being sort of the biggest one that affects most of the species that we're working on. Now in California, this starts getting pretty busy because we have a lot of environmental laws here in California. And so I've organized these in sort of the same sort of way of how many species does this affect, or how likely would you be to run into one of these species. So we have animal cruelty laws. There's animal cruelty laws in most states, and that these would apply to not only wildlife, but dogs and other things. Apparently, animal cruelty can be applied in those ways. It's important to know about the California Environmental Quality Act. We'll touch on that in a second. And these 5303 are the California versions. They're the Fish and Game Code requirements that we have here in California. And we have our own Endangered Species Act and what's called a fully protected bird law. This was sort of the Endangered Species Act a long time ago before we had it. So I encourage all of you to dig into the details of this, and we have most of the details in our best management practices. So there's a whole laws appendix in these BMPs so that you can check out those and see what these say. But I'd like to give you a little synopsis of what I think is important. So the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the California Fish and Game Code 3503 are pretty similar to one another. And so you'll hear a lot of discussion about the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and its interpretation and what's changing right now. We can largely ignore that in California because we have our own law and none of that is getting affected. So we're just going to operate in basically the same way, regardless of what's happening with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. It's important to know whether or not your project that you're working on qualifies for CEQA. And this is largely related to mitigation measures. And so we can look at those a little bit more closely, but that it's just important to know whether these apply to your job or not. And we have our own endangered species law with our own endangered species list, which means that there's 2 lists of endangered species to know about and being able to operate within. You have to know both of them. Now, these laws create a couple of difficult gray areas for us that I want to talk about. So the first is we have a specific raptor law that protects inactive raptor nests. So after a red-tailed hawk, the young leave, and we say normally you can remove the tree once the nest is inactive. That's not true for raptors in California. And this creates a difficult situation because if those nests are protected forever, that means you can never remove those trees, and there aren't very good sort of ways to go about getting permission to remove those trees and those inactive nests that are no longer in use, and that's sort of something that we seem to be bumping up again and don't have a lot of answers for at the moment. Similarly, there are 2 species, the European starling and the house sparrow, of non-native birds that are clearly not protected in California. But there are a whole variety of other species, such as the Eurasian collared dove, that are clearly not native, but their protected status has a little bit of gray area. So that's just something to be aware of generally speaking, we're sort of following this native birds are protected, but there's definitely some confusing aspects of that in California. And then what exactly is an active nest? So we just went over our definition of active nest and what we're using, and that's one that's based on the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. But in California, we actually don't have a definition of active nest. So there's some gray area in interpretation. And so, yeah. Courtney, do you have any other thoughts on California wildlife laws? Did I say anything incorrectly here or something that you'd like to comment on?
No, I think you said it well, and I was just going to say I'm sure there's many questions about it, but as you stated, there is some confusion on, in those gray areas. So I'll answer questions as best I can, but I think you stated it well.
Man, I keep looking for these wildlife biologists to get in some fights with me on these broadcasts, but it hasn't happened yet. I'm hoping Courtney will really tell me we're doing something wrong later. So a couple of ways that I run into these bird laws is that on tree removal permits, right? So my company sees tree removal permits pretty regularly. So the city of Los Gatos has a column here that says, are there any listed, please list any birds living in the tree that you're looking to prune or remove or whatever. And so this is the city's attempt to help us follow state and federal laws by putting in these policies in place by saying, okay, well, we'll just check in during our permitting process. Similarly, I deal with a lot of construction projects, and so they have conditions of approval, and there's links to all of these things in the handout that I sent out, so it got quite long. So if you want to read any of these in detail, please don't try to read it on the screen here. There's links to it where you can go and look at these different places. But this is, there's almost always, when I see conditions of approval for construction projects, something about potential impacts to nesting birds and the laws around them. Okay, so let's focus on trying to figure out what category we're operating in. And we use this for what level of training do we think is appropriate in order to be able to work in those areas during those times. So the first thing that we need to talk about is the breeding season. And this is a graph that I made and showed last week of basically, it looks like breeding happens a little less in February and a little less in August than in sort of April, March to July period. But there really is a lot of breeding and nesting that happens during this time period compared to the rest of the year. But that in California, and so these data are from Northern California, and would probably be even more true in Southern California, you would have a little bit of nesting, a little bit of breeding happening in every month of the year. So we always want to be aware of nests, but we're much more likely to find them in April than we are in November. So next we would want to focus on our wildlife habitat. And we have this sort of system that we've developed that we don't think is perfect. We're not sure it's working very well in California, but we think it's the best we have right now. So if anyone has a better system or comments on this system, let us know. But we have this checklist here that we've created within the best management practices for people to go out and try to assess what's the value of the habitat? How likely are we to find nesting wildlife in these areas? So in this area here, I would start saying, okay, it looks like it's within or adjacent to water bodies and has riparian vegetation present. I don't need to go any farther. I'm working in a riparian area. I know that that's really important in California for breeding habitat. I know that there's a lot of regulations around riparian areas. There probably needs to be a wildlife biologist involved. There probably needs to be a lot of permitting. So anyways, this is our sensitive habitat, and there are other sensitive habitats, but this is the main one that I think we're going to be bumping into. So I think that this one's pretty clear. What might be a little less clear is if we come up to our work site and it looks something like this. So maybe it's a park in the edge of an urban area that's managed for wildlife habitat, something along those lines. And so then again, we pull up our checklist and we start going through it and we say, well, it seems like there's pretty low impervious surfaces, there's pretty high plant species diversity, pretty high plant structural diversity, right? A lot of grasses and shrubs and trees. There's many mature, dead, and dying trees, and quite a few wildlife present, right? I'm seeing birds flying around and things like that. But there's also quite a bit of human use around. We think that humans are definitely impacting it. It's far from water bodies. So while it's not clear, I think that we generally classify this as a high value habitat and an area that we'd prefer to be working in the non-breeding season rather than the breeding season if we can control that. Then maybe we pull up to the site and it's my average job of a shopping center parking lot. I've done many, many thousands of trees inventoried on sites just like this. And this is pretty clearly a low habitat value area. We can find nesting wildlife in these areas, right? We would expect occasionally to find some nests in these trees or other places, but that largely we think that the areas that we saw before are more likely to have nesting wildlife. Okay, so at this point, I'd like to pull up our poll. I believe this is poll number 2, Ryan, where we are going to ask you, what do you think? Is this a sensitive, a high, or a low habitat value area? This is from one of my job sites in the Bay Area. And let's go through it a little bit, right? So I am thinking that we've got a pretty even split if we use this checklist system, and that I have slightly more in the low than I do in the high. So I would be classifying this as a low habitat value area. But this is exactly what we've been struggling with, is we talk about it as it's so easy to figure out high, sensitive, low, and then we get out in the field and it's actually really difficult, right? So I think that if somebody classified this as high and treated it as high, I would have no problem with that, right? If that's great. But I think that we could do a lot to start experimenting with this and thinking about this system and see how it works. So let's try it one more time. We've got, we'll pull up a similar poll, and we've got another site here. This is a roof garden with basically all California native species. What do we think of this one? So it pains me to say this in some ways, but I do think that I would classify this roof garden as a high value habitat. It doesn't really make sense to me that a roof garden would be a high value habitat, but I've actually been birding on this roof garden pretty regularly, and there's a lot of birds out there, and I think treating it as a high value habitat is probably the right call. But I think like we've talked about, there's a lot of gray area, and I'm not sure what to do exactly here. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about sensitive habitats. So maybe some of you noticed that one of our checklists here on our sensitive habitats is critical habitat or known sensitive species. So how the heck would we figure this out in California? What would we do? So I'll give you a little example here. The HBC office is in Pleasanton, California. And so here's an aerial photo of the area where you can see sort of this riparian that's Del Val Creek running behind, or Arroyo del Valle running behind the office there. And then this is a tree that we had removed a little while ago. So, you know, we'd want to do a little research when we go to do this tree work. And so we go into CNDDB, and it's pretty easy to make an account. I did it in 3-5 minutes, something like that. It's all free, and we have the ability to do something like this. So the video quality on this is not amazing, so I apologize for that. I got to figure out how to capture better video quality on my computer. But what we're going to do is we're going to walk through, hopefully it plays here. We're going to walk through how we go and look up something on CNDDB. So I type CNDDB into my web browser and pull up the maps and data. We're going to go to the quick view tool. And while that opens up, we're basically looking for threatened and endangered species in our area. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a quad that's called Livermore, which is the quad that my office is in, or my old office before I was there. And so then we have, so this is the area, and we're going to highlight that, and we're going to pull it up and check out. First thing I'm going to do is sort it for state listed species, right? So we've got a couple endangered species here, and I'm just going to go through the list slowly and see what catches my eye. And the first thing that caught my eye is bald eagle. Bald eagle's on the state endangered list. And so when we type in bald eagle in the top part here, it gives us a couple of options. And so the one that I want to look at is predicted habitat of the bald eagle. And so when I pull that up on the map, it shows up plenty of predicted habitat in our area. And it's actually got moderate habitat in our work area, right? If this is right where the office is, the Arroyo sort of right behind there, they've classified as moderate habitat. And so I'm not too concerned about that because I can identify an eagle nest. It's like, you know, 8 feet across and really obvious in a tree. So I'm going to keep looking. And so the next thing that catches my eye as we sort of scroll down our state list is a threatened species called tricolored blackbird. So I don't know much, well, I do, but if I don't know much about a tricolored blackbird, I like doing research in all about birds. And so I'd put in tricolored blackbird into all about birds to try to learn more about it and try to figure out what might be important about this to know. Is this a species I should be worried about? And so I see that it looks quite a bit like red-winged blackbird, and that would be maybe my identification problem. But in life history, I can glance at the habitat and see that it mostly hangs out in wetland areas. And then maybe I'd scroll down to the nesting areas and see that it nests mostly in cattails and rushes and low willows and things like that, and say, okay, well, removing an oak doesn't seem like it's going to have much impact on this species, so that's something that, that we'd want to note. And so then we'll sort by our federal list and do the same thing and see what catches our eye, what we might want to do more research about before we go out on this site. And the one that catches my eye is red-legged frog. So red-legged frog is federally endangered, but actually not on the state list at all, which is another interesting dynamic of having two separate lists. And so when I type in red-legged frog, I get the option to look at the critical habitat for it. And so one of the things we know is that critical habitat is the only thing that, the only aspect that really protects habitat of a species. So we're not just worried about is there a nest there, but we're worried about impacting their critical habitat at all. So we're getting that loaded up in here, and we're going to zoom out and get to a view where we can actually see it. But the critical habitat for the red-legged frog is sort of all around in the area, but not actually in our job site. So I think there's two things interesting of this doesn't seem to be good habitat for red-legged frogs. So I think we can go ahead and schedule our work and go out there and do it. But also that I had no idea there was so much red-legged frog habitat in the Pleasanton area around here. So I found that very interesting. And Courtney and Jillian, any thoughts on CNDDB? Anything else to know about it?
Ryan, I think you covered that very well. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so once we've figured out our habitat value and our breeding season, we then come together to determine our level of training. Right, so for this green area, category 1, we're thinking just a 12-minute video on the Tree Care for Birds website is going to be adequate. And then to work in these areas 2, that's what we're trying to cover today. We're trying to get everyone comfortable working in a low-value habitat during the breeding season and a high-value habitat during the non-breeding season, and comfortable contacting a wildlife biologist and being able to work with them on projects where they are needed. And so we have a wildlife biologist with us here today. So I'd like to bring up Courtney, who's going to tell us a little bit more about how she does pre-work inspections. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
All right, well, thank you for that introduction, Ryan. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about pre-work inspections, and we're going to start just by talking about nests and doing a few polls on what you guys think you know, these photos are. So some of these photos I took, and some I took from the internet. So we're looking to see which one of these is a raptor nest, just based on identification, things that you've learned thus far. And so Ryan Pendleton, do you mind putting that poll up? Okay, so let's talk about it really quick. I'm just gonna go back to the last slide so we can chat about that for just a quick second. Okay, so A is a squirrel nest, B is mistletoe, and C is a raptor nest. So generally speaking, characteristics of a squirrel nest, it's mostly leaves, and it'll be in the shape of a ball. And then raptor nests are more conical. The other indication, this one is a little bit tricky, but most of the time an indication that it's a squirrel nest is that it's it could be out kind of on like a branch. You know, it doesn't have to be on the middle trunk of the tree. So a raptor nest will be usually centered on the trunk of the tree, and then a squirrel nest will usually be could be, you know, far out on the limb. It doesn't really need much to sustain it. And then mistletoe, that can grow anywhere within a tree, so from what I understand. And then with this one, it was a little bit more difficult. So A is mistletoe. People said that B is a raptor nest, so it is supported by you know, that main trunk, but it's a squirrel nest, and most, like, the indication for that being a squirrel nest is that it's mostly leaves. So raptors will not use leaves in their nest at all. They use branches. They'll break off branches. A or they'll pick them up from the ground and they will, use them to make the nest, but they will not use leaves. And so C is a raptor nest. It's actually a Cooper's hawk nest. Cooper's hawks are some of the more difficult nests to find. Just in general, they are in trees that are really well leafed out, and they're just, generally speaking, just difficult to find. So C is a raptor nest. And Ryan, I'm seeing questions come up. Did we want to we can just wait for those?
Yeah, Jillian's in charge. She's gonna bring them up either at the end or interrupt us. So I think if something catches your eye, feel free to go for it. But largely, you can just wait until Jillian asks them for us.
Okay. Okay, so how to find a nest. Somebody asked me this the other day. I was doing some tree work. Two things that I usually tell people is listen and look. So I would listen depending on the nest stage. So, and these are two photos that I took. So this is a vermilion, both of them are vermilion flycatchers. The one on the left is a male. Of course, the nice, bright, red, shiny male. And then the female is actually on the right, and she's in the nest. So I was watching the male and female for quite a while, and eventually the female went to the nest, and she was nest building. So that's her butt facing us, but she was building the nest at the time. So depending on the nest stage, often birds can give away their nest location through their calls. So, if they're nest building, most of the time they're still within the breeding phase, and they'll be calling to each other, doing a lot of breeding calls, especially with raptors. And then in the incubation phase is when they start to get a little bit quieter and not as loud. And then during the chick phase, you'll definitely hear those chicks calling mom for food and begging for food and things like that. My example was a male Phainopepla. So a male Phainopepla is funny. They'll just sit at the top of a tree. So they'll have, the female will have her nest in a tree, and he'll sit within a certain radius of her and do these kind of funny little territorial. He'll fly up, and then he'll come back down to the tree. And so it's almost like you could draw a circle, like a circle around him, and then the female is somewhere in the middle. So he'll kind of, he's very territorial, and they're fairly easy to find. So so there's certain stages where you can listen, and they'll give away their nest location. And then we'll talk about chicks in a second. I have a few videos of examples. And then just looking, watching their behavior. So what is the bird doing? So I'll just go through the different nest stages really quick. So nest building, what are they doing? The bird could be gathering nesting material. And if you see both adults going to the same tree repeatedly with something in their mouth, I think most of you will not have binoculars, but if you see something white and fluffy in their beak and the bird is brown, and you're like, huh, what is that white thing in their mouth? It's not an insect. There's no white insect that we're looking at. It's actually nesting material. So they'll be repeatedly going back to the same tree, and they'll be building a nest. And then incubation is a little tough. It's when they start to kind of get quiet and a little bit more secretive. But generally with incubation, sometimes a male could be, feeding a female that's on the nest and incubating. And so if you see one bird, not two, during nest building, there should be two, but one during incubation, and a male will for certain birds, a male will go out and find food for the incubating female, and he will feed her on the nest. And that is an indication of incubation. Feeding chicks is the easiest. If you see two birds going repeatedly out finding food and coming back, and you are listening for chicks begging, then that is when they're feeding chicks. And then fledging, the chicks will still call. They won't be at the nest, but they'll still call maybe from the tree or from a nearby tree, and they're still begging for food. Oh, okay, so this just talks about some of it. So let's see. Here we have, a bird calling. Sometimes it could be an alarm call too. I didn't really touch on that, but alarm calls are also an indication that there's a nest. So if you get close to a nest and the bird doesn't like that, they will give an alarm call. And then let's see. So you have a nest in a cavity here. Oh, this is good. You have a nest or a bird with nesting material. Yes, Ryan, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to ask a question that was coming up, seems relevant to this.
Sure.
How far away from our project area should we be looking for nesting wildlife? And should we be looking for nesting wildlife on the ground as well as up in the trees?
Okay, so definitely you should be looking for nesting birds on the ground as well as in the tree, because even though you may want to cut a tree, if there is a bird that's nesting on the ground or in a bush that is surrounding the tree, then that might take your tree out of the equation, if that makes sense. If the buffer, and that has to do with buffers that we will touch on next week, but depending on the bird and its sensitivity, if it is a ground or bush nesting bird and it is within a certain distance of your tree, then that could essentially take your tree out of the trimming or removal process, just by, for buffers. And then how close or how far away should you be looking for nests? I mean, if you're doing, so I do two different types of nesting bird surveys. So I do visual and I do listening nesting bird surveys, and then I'm standing far back away from the tree so that I can observe everything that's going on around the tree. So I will stand, maybe 50 feet away, and I'll just be able to see every bird that's coming in and out of the tree and see what's going on. But then if it gets to the point where you're not getting anywhere or you don't have enough time and you need to do a very close visual inspection, and that's necessary in order to complete your nesting bird survey, then I've gotten right up to the tree, under the tree, and then I do a visual survey, inspecting the tree, looking for nests and things like that. It just depends on how much time you have and, if the birds are cooperating, essentially. It really is dependent on environmental factors. So sometimes the birds cooperate and I can do a nesting bird survey from afar, and sometimes they're not cooperating and I just walk straight up to the tree and do a visual inspection. Hopefully that answered that question.
Courtney, can I ask a question?
Yes.
So an earlier Q&A was, what are the protections around squirrel nests?
There are no protections for squirrel nests that I am aware of. We just make note of them. And we try not to, cut them out of the tree, but there are no protections that I'm aware of.
So
yeah, we'll try to talk about that a little bit more next time in terms of what to do around squirrel nests. But most of the squirrels that are nesting in the areas that we're dealing with are non-native eastern fox squirrels, and so have really quite minimal protection. I think animal cruelty would probably be the one law that would really apply to them.
Yes, that's what I was hoping you'd mention, the gray squirrel. Yeah, okay.
Well, there's several different species of tree squirrels in California. I believe there's more or less four different species, eastern fox squirrel being the most common, but there are native and non-native squirrels in California.
Right, thank you, Ryan.
Okay, so Ryan, actually, do you want to come back and do the scrub jay calls really fast?
Yeah, so if you want to click these for me, Courtney, we'll start with the upper left. And so what, I think you have to click, yeah, there we go. All right. So this is what I would call a flight call, where you often hear this call sort of as they're flying from sort of tree to tree or something like that. And so we have sort of different designations for different calls as sort of how we're interpreting what they mean. So let's do upper right next. So this is more of a standard scrub jay call that's happening. You hear this very often in California when you're going around. This is just them sort of checking in, doing their standard call. And if you want to pause that one and play the one below it. what I would call an alarm call. So this is something that we should be paying attention to, where potentially they're trying to protect their nest from a, from a predator, excuse me. And so we might be that predator as one that's coming up near their nest. They're trying to scare us away or alert others that there's a predator near. And hearing things like that, we can start using our other clues to figure out where there might be a nest nearby. And I think this is one example of how we might do that. Does that sound right, Courtney?
Yeah, so I would just tell people, so I went to a listening, a bird sounds of California workshop this last spring. And so a lot of it is like, I'm musically challenged, but that last one, I don't know if you guys can tell, but the pace of the call quickened. And so there was some, urgency to it. And so I don't know if you guys could tell, but the first two, it was more, even toned, and the calls, were, like you said, the first one was in flight. So they beat their wings and then they fly and then they call at the same time. But that last one, it was quicker and there was some urgency there. So that's a good indication just to listen for what an alarm call could sound like. Okay. Are you good, Ryan, on that slide?
Good.
Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna play this video in the top right. So I just wanted to talk about the photos just really fast. So this is a tree swallow. These are all chicks, and this is mom coming in with food. So tree swallows are cavity nesters, so their nest was not in this tree. This is a good just visual for people to see that the birds do not need to be in their nest or in their tree in order to be begging for food. So that kind of raises a little bit of questions that I can answer later about, at what point does the nest become inactive, and when do I need to not worry about them? So in this instance, these tree swallows were nesting in a tree swallow box that was over 200 feet away, and they were calling for food from mom. And so at that point, I would say that tree swallow box was inactive because they had fledged the nest, and they had moved on and were far enough away from it and not reliant on it. And then this right here is a hummingbird. This is a hummingbird female feeding a chick inside a nest. That nest is tiny, and the way I found it was that she kept repeatedly going back to the same bush, and she was feeding her chick, and so she went and collected food, and she would keep coming back repeatedly to the same bush, and that's essentially how I found it. We'll just play this really quick. This is a feeding chick example. This is a northern mockingbird. This is a common bird that a lot of people in California. So those chicks, you didn't see them. And then all of a sudden, as soon as they kind of thought mom was around, or they kind of sensed her presence, they popped up and immediately started begging. I'll play it one more time just so you guys can listen. I know it's more of a visual aid, but just really listen to what it, oops. Oh gosh. There. Just one more time, just so you can listen. Okay, so, and you can YouTube, you can Google, begging chicks or, feeding chicks, and it's all over the internet. So if you guys need more examples, but I have one more. Oh, this is Ryan's slide. Do you want to talk about this, Ryan? I'll play it.
Sure. This is just another example where I could hear, if you want to go ahead and play, I could hear these chicks begging from hundreds of feet away, from really quite far. And so this is a quaking aspen tree up in Montana, where I'd heard them. There were holes all over the tree. I had no idea which one it was, but you can hear that really high-pitched call. And then here comes mom with an insect. and they get a little louder, and then it's like, okay, I know where the nest is. We really wouldn't even need to know where this nest is. We would know I'm not going to work in this tree until these young leave. But anyways, if you hearing something and then finding mom and watching mom go to the nest is often a good way to find nests.
Okay. And then another one, this one's a little bit less obvious. So I just wanted to talk about bush tits because they're pretty common in pine trees. This one, well, I find them a lot in pine trees. So this one is a hanging nest, and so this one's kind of like a cavity nest where you won't see the chicks, and so you'll just see mom and dad repeatedly going into a nest, you know, with food, and they'll enter the cavity, and I'll show you guys. These were both in California, and I found both of these nests. I don't remember how for each one, but both bush tits.
So Courtney, may I intrude with a question?
Yes.
So someone is asking, will you go over definitions of fledged, or when a nest is complete and the young are self-sufficient enough to start doing tree work?
When they are not reliant upon the nest is usually a definition of fledged that I've seen most often. So even if they're, so if they're not reliant upon the nest, or actually the nest tree itself is usually a definition of fledged, and that's usually how I define it. However, I will say this can be a gray area, and the only reason I say that is because different biologists consider fledged different, you know, there's different, you know, every biologist is different, but basically, so like if you're thinking of like a raptor, if the chicks are still in the nest itself and mom is feeding them at the nest and they're using the nest or even the nest tree, then they technically are not fledged yet. They have to not be reliant on the tree itself or the nest.
And Courtney, I believe we're really just talking about a matter of days here. Pretty quickly, they don't use the nest hardly at all anymore. Is that correct? Once they're out of the nest and flying around, they don't come back and spend much time in the nest very often. That's correct, right?
Exactly. So that's why it's important. So yeah, once they're not relying on it, then they're gone, and then that's it. Yeah.
Okay, so I'd like to interject that there are owls in particular that do hang around in the nest tree for quite some time before their muscles are actually strong enough for them to fly well. And the Cooper's hawk also, the nestlings, even though they leave the nest, the Cooper's hawk's nest fledglings are known to return to the host tree to be fed for a week or more. So there are some exceptions.
Yes, there are. So, and also too about owls, there's such thing as a roost, an owl roost, which is not a nest. And so if you have an owl roost, it's not a nest and it isn't protected. It just is a resting place for the owl. And you're right. Yeah, Cooper's hawks are funny. They get out of the nest quickly, but then they're still reliant on the nest tree itself, and that's what we've found. We have over 100 Cooper's hawk nests in Los Angeles that we watched this last spring, and they fledge the nest really fast, but then you're right, they keep coming back and they use the nest tree and the nest itself for a while. So they're an interesting raptor species.
Yes, thank you.
Yes. So I'll just play this really fast. Bush tip. She's got food, so I hope everybody saw that. She's got a mouthful of food, and she's got maybe 4 or 5 chicks in there. I don't know if you guys can hear it, but and then she comes out empty-handed. So and I'll play it one more time. So she comes in with a mouthful of food. She's got maybe 4 or 5 chicks, and they're growing rapidly. Mom and dad come back repeatedly with a mouthful of food, and they come out empty-handed. So just one more time. Okay, so this is a photo of actually one of the Cooper's Hawks of the over 100 Cooper's Hawks nests that we watched in Los Angeles, and gosh, it's cut off at the bottom. I didn't know that had happened. I apologize. So this bottom arrow is pointing to down and feathers. This is sort of indicative of Cooper's Hawk nests. You're not always going to see down. However, a lot of birds do use like fluff or something to line the nest with in order to make it warm for their chicks. So, you know, Cooper's Hawks aren't the only ones that do this. It's just that this is from the fledglings. They lose all their down feathers and it gets caught on the nest. And then here's some whitewash. The street below was covered in it, so that's also a very good indication that you might have a nest. Above you is looking for just these kind of splashes of whitewash. And then I just wanted to point out the juvenile here. The feathers are not adult feathers yet, and then the adult right here. You know, you'd have to know Cooper's Hawks in order to understand, you know, juvenile versus adult. But I just wanted to point it out. They're a little bit fluffier, a little bit more awkward. Can't fly yet, you know, quite yet. So they have, you know, different characteristics than the adult. And the adult had brought back a meal to the nest, and so they were still reliant on the nest at that time.
So Courtney, there's another question.
Yes.
I'm afraid the questions are coming a little out of sequence with your topic for the sake of the moment, but the question is, if an inactive raptor nest are inactive raptor nests protected, and what is the proper legal process for removing a tree that has an inactive nest in it, such as Cooper's hawk or red-tailed hawk nests?
So that was one of the gray areas that Ryan kind of touched on, and I don't have a better answer than Ryan, unfortunately. So it is a gray area, and it's on a case-by-case basis. So generally what I've seen is that public safety and utilities, for the most part, have a lot of leeway in terms of removing inactive raptor nests. But beyond that, I haven't seen too many inactive raptor nests removed. So it would be an agency consultation. So you'd probably, if it's close to the nesting season, say you want to remove it in August, they're probably going to ask you, and by they I mean probably CDFW, is probably going to ask you to have a biologist go to the nest to confirm that it is inactive. And I actually did do that for Verizon Wireless this last year. They had a great horned owl nest in one of their towers. They knew that it was a great horned owl nest. I had to go and ensure that the nest was no longer active and that they had fledged. And once I had done that and written a report, then Verizon Wireless was able to remove that nest from their tower. But that is essentially, you know, I think they could consider that a public safety issue. So,
so Courtney,
yes.
Right. So thinking out of the box for a minute,
sure.
What would your thoughts be about recommending that if that tree with a large inactive nest exists, that relocating that nest, if possible, in an adjacent tree that's appropriate for the nest, and securing it to a tree nearby?
I've never heard of that being done. If you do that, that would be crazy. That would be really cool. Sure. That's okay. This next slide is super simple. It's just a cavity nest. I just wanted to show you guys there's an owl in there. You know, this is just another example of just a nest that you guys would have to see. Even one of my other biologists couldn't even see the owl in there. So, this is taken through binoculars, so it's, you know, to the naked eye, you wouldn't see it, but, you know, upon further inspection, you could see that there's an owl in there. And then I'm sorry, just a comment, we never saw the chicks until they fledged because it was so deep in the tree, and that can happen in many instances. Okay, so the ground nest, we kind of touched on this before, if there's a nest on the ground or in a bush. My only comment is, and it may seem kind of stupid and like But if you're walking on the ground, if you're walking around the tree that you need to cut, and say a bird flushes from the ground and you basically almost step on this poor bird, there is a good chance that there may be a nest in that bush or on the ground, because a bird will not wait for you to step on it unless it has something to protect, unless there's something there for it to worry about. So I've done this multiple times when just walking transects in an area. I've been walking and then all of a sudden a bird flushes and I literally almost step on the poor thing, and then there's a nest right below my feet. So they won't wait for you. Birds are smart. They usually get out of the way. Okay, so some of the things we already talked about, active nests, whitewash. Sometimes birds, raptors, for example, will leave, dead things, dead squirrels, dead birds. They'll be below or hanging from it. It's cute. So some things like that. Inactive, you can look. Spider webs are a good indication that it's inactive. Old-looking branches, just meaning I think you guys have probably a better concept of this than even I do, but if a branch or all the branches within a nest look old and weathered, like the nest was not built up, then it's likely inactive. If the nest is falling apart, if it's leaning to the side, or if you stand underneath the nest and you look up and you can see through the nest and there's a hole in the middle, it's not being used because they're not going to let the eggs fall right through the nest to the ground. Birds are pretty harsh with their nests, and they do fall apart by the end of the season, but raptors build them back up. As you know, a raptor nest could be kind of essentially non-existent almost, but then they'll just build it right back up and it'll be good as new. This is a general statement down here, that for the most part, passerines, like your little birds, do not reuse nests from year to year. That is a very general statement. But that's true in general. They don't reuse nests from year to year, but as everybody does know, raptors reuse nests from year to year, so you do need to look for that.
I'd just like to do a quick little summary of what we've covered so far. And so my computer is not working all of a sudden. There we go. We talked a little bit about how many wildlife laws there are in California. Encourage people to check it out on their own, but we gave you sort of the highlights of what might be important. That the breeding season in California, we've suggested as February 1st to August 31st. That are how we're going to go about identifying habitat values, and that we think it's difficult, but we have one method for people to go out and try. That you can use CNDDB to try to figure out sensitive species and endangered species in your area. That going out and doing a pre-work inspection is our best tool to try to minimize our impacts to nesting wildlife. And Courtney taught us a few tools and tricks to try to be better at that. And that we have an activity for you all to do so that you can go out and work on your pre-work inspection skills and submit this so that you can get credit for that for your certificate if you're working towards a certificate. And next Wednesday, we'll be talking about buffers in California, and Courtney's going to be back with us again, so I'm excited to do that. But I'm also excited about talking about white terns, or I'm just going to be moderator tomorrow hearing about white terns in Hawaii. So lots of options. Everyone's welcome to join for every session. When you close your Zoom screen here, a window should pop up with a quiz that isn't apparently working for everyone. So Ryan Pendleton is going to put a link to the quiz in the chat. Is that right, Ryan?
Yes, sir.
Great. And at this point, I think that we can open it back up for question, answer, discussion, quiz. Everybody's welcome to drop off whenever they want, but we'll be here answering questions for at least the next 20 minutes. I assume we have 20 minutes worth of questions, Jillian. What do you think?
We have about 5, I think, that are worth everyone hearing.
Great.
So there was an interesting question relevant to when birds are nesting in trees versus roosting. the writer of the question is obviously thinking of trees that have enough, that are a big roost site, birds, maybe like herons. And so the question is, what are the legal protections regarding large roost sites compared to nesting sites? And in terms of, perhaps if we need to remove that tree that's a roost site for a number of birds, what are the legal considerations there?
None that I'm aware.
Yeah, I believe the answer is none. Roosting habitat, habitat in general is really only protected when it's critical habitat, as I understand it, from sort of a wildlife law perspective. So if it's not an endangered species, roosting habitat is definitely not protected. And yeah, that doesn't mean we should go out and remove it all. It's important habitat, important that we try to support more birds and wildlife in our urban forests, and protecting roosting habitat is definitely a good idea, but not legally required.
Right. And, I'm aware from our experience that the Coastal Commission sometimes has additional regulations or controls over certain species along the coastline. So that may be something to investigate.
I've somehow never interacted with the Coastal Commission. Of all the public agencies in the tree world that I've interacted with in the Bay Area, never the Coastal Commission.
We had such a situation recently in Long Beach. So, okay, and so there's a question here about, I think there needs to be some clarification as to the added protections that apply to eagle nests versus hawk nests. Someone was asking specifically if Cooper's hawk's nests have the same protections as eagle nests. So there's...
Yeah, I saw this question. I'll take a stab at it because I think I understand what's happening here. Last week, we said that the only nests that were protected when inactive are eagle's nests. And that is true federally. But in California, we have more protections. So all inactive raptor nests are protected, right? So golden eagles and bald eagles have special protections, more so than what Cooper's hawks and red-tailed hawks have. But in California, all of those inactive nests are protected. Did I say that right, Courtney?
Yeah.
Okay. Then someone wanted to know if there was a specific resource to which we can go, either state or federal, that would show us where it says that inactive nests are protected. Which inactive nests are protected?
Yeah, so it's in the best management practices wildlife law section. It's this 3503.5 raptors. So right there.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. And then there was a question about the palm weevil, the Canary Island palm weevil that's killing so many of those palms. And the question was, how are biologists working with this problem?
I have not worked with it at all. Courtney?
I am not.
I'm sure there's people out there working on it, but not us.
So I can just interject that I was involved in a situation of this type, not this spring, and there were about 12 dead Canary Island palms that were slated for removal, and the city in which they existed considered these palms an eminent risk to people and property, but they had some active nests in there. So a great deal of effort was made to identify what species were nesting in those trees, and a permit was obtained from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, to take those birds, and those birds were taken into rehab.
What kind of birds were they?
So most of them actually were non-native birds. There were house sparrows, which are cavity nesters, and there were parrots, but there was also an owl nest there. Yeah. So I think, let's see. I think those were, let me do a quick look here. Yeah, I think those were the only remaining questions that I noted.
Yeah, one of the ones I saw was, are owls raptors? And the answer is yes.
Yes.
Pretty clearly defined in, again, that that law on according to raptors.
Right.
And I see some questions about squirrel nest and rat nests. So we'll
Yes.
try to get to this a little bit more next week, but with scaling everything down to just 3 hours, it's been really difficult to try to get everything in. So wood rats, there are many different species of wood rats, and several of which are, all of which I believe are native and protected in California, but some of which are endangered and threatened and have special protection in California. So being able to tell the difference between them is important. It's on our list for the updated BMPs to get some illustrations of some wood rat nests. I would say generally they're pretty easy to tell apart in that they're enormous and contain a lot of sticks rather than a lot of leaves, is my experience. Courtney?
Yeah, so that's funny. I'm doing a project right now where wood rat nests are being protected, and they can nest in trees. I will say that of all the wood rat nests I've found and trapped wood rats out of, only one has been in a tree. So they kind of do this like multi-tiered, multi-leveled nest because they're pack rats, and so they have like little like essentially, like if you think of a house, it's got like little rooms in different parts of the nest, and it is mostly, if not all, sticks. And they are pretty indicative, and for the most part, we've had big-eared wood rats are the ones that nest in trees, which are not the, here actually in Southern California, the desert wood rat is the protected wood rat with a lot of protections, but not the big-eared wood rat.
Thank you. Ryan, I did forget one question. Is there a resource for going through the steps for signing up for CNDDB?
Yeah, there are many videos that they have up there about how to navigate it and how to use it. I'm not sure I found them very helpful. It was quite intuitive.
So someone has a question about killdeer. Killdeer feign a broken wing when you are close to their nest. If you see this behavior, does that mean you can't do the tree work because there is an active nest? Oh,
you're on mute, Courtney.
Sorry.
got myself. So the question is about killdeer.
No, you're good, Jillian. You're good.
Yeah, no, I got the question. It means that you need to find the nest. They will do that. Most of the time when they have a nest, I've seen them do it a few times when they don't have a nest. And it could be that, honestly, it could be at any nesting stage when they do the broken wing. I have found that they do that rather easily. I think killdeer are the simplest nesters. They'll just do a little scrape like that, and then they'll plop the eggs down. But that they are so loud, and they're so they'll do the broken wing and they'll fly around. So they're interesting nesters. It just, honestly, I think that would just be an indication that you either need to find the nest, there may be a nest nearby, or there may be fledglings, because they did that one, like a killdeer did that one time, but then there were fledglings 50 feet away and they were leading me away from it. So it depends on the situation.
And that's a perfect example leading us right into what we're going to talk about next week, right? I've identified a strong sign of nesting wildlife or a nest itself. What do I do now? And that's what we're planning on talking about next week, how to set up buffers, what work's allowed, not allowed, how birds get impacted by work near them, and things like that.
Oh, here's one last minute question here. How do you distinguish between roosting site versus nesting site when nest is not always visible and there may be whitewash found under roosting site?
I think the answer for most of us would be that we would ask a wildlife biologist to tell us. And that, Courtney, do you want to tell us a little bit about how you would go about doing that?
Behavior. A roosting site is just like a resting site, and a nesting site, and they can roost near a nest. That's true. But it would be behavior. I would definitely go for behavior, and because it's an owl, it might have to end up being maybe a nocturnal survey. So I would, yeah, I think my answer would be similar to Ryan's, that to enlist a wildlife biologist.
All right, what else do you want to talk about, Jillian?
I think that's pretty much it. There's one, I'm not quite clear. Conrad asked, in Courtney's tree inspection, she found a nest egg in it. What about that nest?
That had probably happened. I mean, it definitely happened before I got there. And nests can fail on their own for a multitude of reasons, not being a tree crew. And also I should say that predation on nests can be very high. And part of the reason for a predation on a nest could be a biologist, to be honest with you. So if you're, if that's, that's why you try and hire a good biologist. So, just the act of doing a nesting bird survey, if I get too close to a nest, I could then lead predators to a nest. And so I need to be aware of that as a biologist. Arborists, I would ask that you be aware of that, but then I feel like I'm asking a lot. So I don't know.
Yeah, a couple of hints that people talk about a lot that we tend to do if we don't know not to, is like pointing at a nest repeatedly is probably not a great idea.
Yeah.
And walking up to a nest and turning around and walking back repeatedly is probably not a great idea. So do you have any other tips besides that, Courtney? Those are the two I always hear about.
Those are definitely the two that I hear a lot. Yeah. And yeah, like your scent could lead like mammals to a nest, especially if it's a low nest. That hummingbird nest was maybe waist high, and I had to find it from afar, even though I could have literally walked right up to it. So and bush tits are also, like you said, pointing. I've had bush tit nests be predated by scrub jays very easily. So I think, yeah, just being aware of your proximity to a nest, and then if there is a nest right next to you, just go a different direction. So if you came in from this direction, leave a different direction.
Kind of a good argument for binoculars, right?
Yes, binoculars. Yes, those are helpful.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, I'd like to say thank you to the Western Chapter. Thank you to the Forest Service for funding this workshop, as well as CAL FIRE and many other organizations for funding tree care for birds throughout the year. Thank you, Courtney and Jillian. This has really been great for me, and I really appreciate you joining me. And thanks everyone for tuning in. Any closing thoughts, Courtney or Jillian, before we leave?
Just want to thank you both. You did a splendid job, and we are so grateful to you for all the hard work in preparing for this. Thank you.